Hey, Mama. So today I am answering another question that I received from someone in my email community. So she said that she would love to know my thoughts about stretching, repurposing, and promoting podcast episodes on social and elsewhere. So that is what I'm going to be answering today. All right, let's jump into today's episode. Hey, Mama. Welcome to Marketing Without Socials for Moms, the go-to podcast for moms in business who want to stop relying on social media to build their business and build it in a way that fits their current season of life. I'm your host, Andrea Singletary, a wife, mama of two, and visibility strategist for moms. Each week, I'm giving you the inside scoop on how to increase your visibility, leads, and sales through podcasting, email marketing, and collaborations. Ready to truly make social media optional in your business? Grab your chai tea latte and let's dive into today's episode. Okay, so one of the best things about long-form content like podcasts is that it gives you a big piece of content you can break up and repurpose for other platforms. I'm a firm believer in repurposing your podcast content and any long form content for that matter. So whether it's a blog, YouTube, repurpose that baby. And I'm sure I've said this before on the podcast, but it really helps you reiterate your message across platforms and really create this cohesiveness in your messaging. And so part of repurposing your podcast content is that it allows you to promote your podcast on other platforms too. Now, because like for me, my podcast is like my main platform, I like to drive people to the podcast. So even if I'm repurposing from one of the episodes, 9 times out of 10, the call to action is going to be for them to go and listen to that episode. So here are, my thoughts on effectively repurposing your podcast content. You can repurpose your podcast content into pretty much everything. So when I refer to like repurposing, like it's not necessarily always you driving people to that podcast episode, but more so sharing specific concepts, frameworks, messagings, like main points from the podcast episode. So one, like you can repurpose your podcast episode into a blog. Now, one thing I want to note about this, do not just take the transcript from your podcast episode and put that up and say, here's my blog. How we talk and how we write are two separate things. And so the most effective way to do this is to go in and pull out the main points from that podcast episode and break them down, even further in a blog post. Because you want to make sure you're writing it in a way that's going to be effective. One, that it's going to register with Google, and like see it as being, a good piece of content, a quality piece of content, but also making sure you're able to infuse those keywords and everything because hello, SEO, we want to be leveraging that SEO. Another way you can repurpose your podcast is for email. I do this all the time, and I do it 2 ways. So I will either, like if I'm promoting the podcast episode for that week, I don't just say, hey, I have a new podcast episode on this topic, go listen. No, I pull out a main point or I pull out a story maybe I shared in that episode and highlight that. And then essentially say, hey, if you want the rest of this goodness, like you really want to, hear some good stuff, go listen to the full episode. That's how I do it with emails. And then another way I do it is I will basically pull out 1 or 2 of the main points from the episode and write an entire email on those main points. And then it'll be a different call to action. So not necessarily for them to go listen to the episode, but point them to either one of my offers or if I have a free resource that essentially can help them like take what they read in that email and go and implement it. That's where I'll drive them. So you can do that. You can repurpose your podcast for YouTube videos. Now, I know the YouTube strategist probably looking at me sideways right now, but you can record yourself as you're recording your podcast episode and put it up on YouTube. Now, I don't know YouTube strategy, so I'm not about to say that doing that is going to help you achieve X, Y, and Z. If you really want to leverage YouTube, you got to find you a YouTube strategist. But if you're essentially like, you know what, I just want the video up on YouTube and, help drive more people to my podcast, record yourself as you're recording your podcast episode and put it up on YouTube. You can also repurpose it for threads. So I absolutely love threads for podcasts. Podcasters are over there thriving on threads. Like, it has been such a game changer for me in growing my podcast audience and gaining new aligned listeners. And so similar to the other ways, I will pull out a main point, break it down, and then drive them to go listen to the episode. Or I will pull out a quote. So today I actually did it for one of the episodes that dropped today. Well, when I'm recording this today, not today as this episode goes live, but I pulled out one of the main quotes. And I was I think I put my favorite line from today's episode on the Marketing Without Socials for Moms podcast. And I put what the line was. And I will do little things like that because I'm telling them, what the name of the podcast is. And then I put one of my favorite lines from the episode. And so that'll drive people to go listen to it. So that's another way you can repurpose it. And then let's talk about Instagram. So repurposing for Instagram, I personally don't do this. But I find that it's more effective if you create a carousel post around a couple of the main points of the episode. Or, I recently updated my 12 grid and I have one post where essentially it's kind of like a Q&A. So there's a question and then the answer is driving them to a specific podcast episode. So if you can make it engaging like that versus just putting up a video clip of you recorded yourself while recording the podcast episode, giving them a little bit more context and giving them more of a reason to actually go and listen to it. But also, again, you don't have to drive them to the podcast episode. You can drive them to one of your offers if that makes sense. You can drive them to a free resource if that makes sense. But and it will make sense. If you are creating podcast content that supports your business goals, then every episode should have a call to action that either drives people to a free resource or to one of your offers. So you can basically just pull out those main points and go ahead and repurpose it for another platform. So because a podcast episode is much longer, you may be able to create a piece of content around each main point instead of trying to put all of the main points of your episode in a single post, carousel post or something like that. And so that's the nice thing of going from long form to short form content is that you can just take bite-sized pieces of your long form content and make multiple pieces of content. So that is the repurposing aspect. Now, as far as promoting your podcast on other platforms, I've already touched on the emails thing. Like I said, I don't just say, hey, I dropped a new episode today. This is the topic. Go listen. You gotta give people a reason to click. You gotta give them a juicy tidbit, dropping them in the middle of a story or, speaking to a specific pain point or desire they have. You gotta motivate them to click and go elsewhere. Again, threads and Facebook groups have been phenomenal for podcast growth. I'm in a Facebook group. I think it's the Brilliant Mompreneurs Facebook group. And every week they post a thread where you can share your latest podcast episode. I do it every week and it's been great. I see growth from that. I see people finding my podcast that way. And the other thing is when it comes to the whole sharing your podcast episodes on Threads and Facebook groups. I've talked about this before, but treating your podcast as a resource library. So this is one of the concepts I teach inside a podcast switch strategy, but you creating those strategic pieces of content that answer specific questions. So that way, when you are scrolling Threads, you are scrolling Facebook groups, and somebody asks a question that you have a podcast episode on, you can pop in and direct them to that episode. And so that's a really great way to promote your podcast on other platforms. Specifically, like I said, with Threads and Facebook groups. Like, as a business owner with a podcast, you want to attract the right listeners, and the right listeners are the ones asking the questions that you have the answer to. So you want to make sure you are creating those strategic pieces of content that are answering those questions that your people are asking. I am really, really big on this. And the reason why is that I've seen it time and time again for myself, and I've seen it time and time again for my clients who really do this. They not only grow their podcast audience, but they really do attract their ideal clients. Like, it's just this amazing phenomenon. And then the best part is that because people can search Threads, people can search Facebook groups for specific keywords, people will later on find that link that you shared to your podcast episode. I see it happen all the time. I still see from posts that I've commented on a year ago, people are liking it today. And so they're finding it and they're able to go and listen to my podcast and binge my podcast. So I think it's really kind of shifting how you are looking at your podcast and how you're looking at growing it. The focus is not just to grow in numbers. The focus really needs to be on growing your audience with the right people, the people who actually want and need what you have to offer. So that is one thing. And then another thing is too with growing your podcast. So with your show notes need to be on your website, and they need to be like a blog post, so to speak. Now, I'm not saying it has to be the same length as a blog post typically is, but you need to be incorporating keywords, and you need to have it on your website. And the reason why is that you're able to leverage SEO to drive more traffic to your podcast. I've shared before how, I have episodes where you can type in Google certain keywords and my show notes for that episode comes up as one of the top searches on Google's, on the first page of Google and everything. And so the other thing with your show notes too is embed the media player. If you can get people to stay on your website and listen to the episode and they start exploring your website, that is going to work great in your favor, because essentially that's the goal, right? We want them looking at our services and our offers and everything. So if you can get them hanging out on your website and getting them clicking around and everything, and they found the link to your freebie, they're joining your email list. That's what we want. Again, we are business owners with a podcast. We are not influencers. We're not hobby podcasters. Our goal is to sell our offers. And so it's really just being strategic about it. So, okay, that is that one. Another way to grow your podcast audience is to create a podcast playlist as a lead magnet. I have done this many, many times, and it is so effective. I primarily do it when I am doing a speaking engagement or guesting on podcasts, but I have a few different playlists. So I have some visibilities, I have a visibility specific playlist. I have a podcast launch specific playlist, and then I have a podcast strategy / monetization specific playlist. And so I will promote the playlist. So I create a landing page, and essentially They sign up on the landing page, they get on my email list, and then they're sent the link to access the podcast playlist. So to give an example of how effective this was, last year I spoke at Gabby Cox. She hosted, I think it's called like the Grow Your Biz Without Social Summit. So I spoke at her summit and then a couple of other summits, and I promoted my Get Visible Off Socials podcast playlist. So from those 3 summits that I spoke at, I generated almost 200 leads, meaning that I had almost 200 people sign up for that podcast playlist and got on my email list. So that was really effective because 1, I grew my email list, but 2, I had all those people tuning in and binging the podcast because they wanted to know how they could get visible outside of social media. So looking at your podcast content, like, do you have any themes? Like, do you have any podcast episodes that really connect to one another? And this goes back to that I talked about back in episode 230 about the podcast sales funnel. You're creating those multiple touch points. So it can serve dual purposes. Like, yes, you want to grow your podcast audience, but also you want to attract the right leads and nurture them and convert them into your offers. And so it's all connected. It's all connected. But creating those podcast playlists as a lead magnet, that's really effective. Now let's talk about promoting your podcast on Instagram. I don't believe in prioritizing Instagram for promoting your podcast. And the reason why is that 1, you are penalized for driving people off of the platform. Yes, I know there are things like mini chat and you have people comment a word and different things like that. But even with that, 1, you have to make sure that the people actually check their DMs and, then click the link and go off the platform to go and listen. And so I've found for myself and even clients that I've worked with, it just has not been the most effective way to grow their audience. Like, I've seen people create the separate Instagram pages for their podcast. And it's like, again, what is your end goal? As a business owner with a podcast, your podcast is supposed to be driving people to your offers. So if you have this business Instagram page and then you have a podcast Instagram page, it's defeating the purpose. Like, where are you trying to drive people ultimately? So, and then again, me as a busy mama, I do not have the capacity for it. I mean, I barely am doing anything with my current Instagram page. Now you want me to have a second one? That's not going to work for me. So I don't feel like it's more effective. Like, it's way more effective to really find those people who are asking specific questions that your podcast has the answer to and sharing the episodes with them, or leveraging SEO so that way the people who are searching Google, searching the podcast listening apps for, the answers to their questions, them finding you that way. Because those people who are actively searching for a solution, those are your ready to invest clients. Those are the people who know they have a problem, they're sick of that problem, and they're ready to solve it. And so, again, you are a business owner with a podcast. So your goals are different. And you're just getting caught up on, trying to increase your downloads. It's just not the most effective thing. You know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to see, I'm like scrolling back in episode 235. I talked all about, downloads, how, you don't need a whole bunch of downloads to actually start converting people into your offers. And so if that is your goal for your podcast is part of your visibility, marketing, and sales strategy, the number one focus is not necessarily getting more downloads. The number one focus is, yes, growing your audience with your ideal clients, but also nurturing and converting them. And so you can convert your listeners, even if you have a small audience. Like, when I first started podcasting and the first time I signed a client from my podcast, I was averaging 30, 35 downloads per episode. It wasn't a whole lot, So, and I don't even want to say it wasn't a whole lot. Like, I take that back. That's, 30 to 35 people who are potentially listening to my podcast each week. Like, if I was leading a training or a workshop in a room filled with 30, 35 people, that would be a lot. I would feel amazing. And so, however many people are listening to your podcast, the fact that you have anybody listening, and if they are consistently listening to your podcast, that is a lead. You can convert them. So anyways, let me get off my soapbox about that. But these are the different ways to, one, repurpose your podcast content, and then two, promote your podcast on other platforms to really grow your audience and everything. Like, yes, I know we want to grow our audience. We want to see those downloads go up, but they are just vanity metrics. Like, I feel like the most important thing you need to really be looking at is, are you seeing those conversions? Are people who, sign on to work with you telling you that they, found you on your podcast? Or I have it happen all the time when I'm working with a client and they're like, yeah, I remember you saying that on the podcast. Like, that's what you want. Like, that's success right there, So don't get so caught up in the vanity metrics that are downloads. But yes, share about your podcast across platforms and everything. And again, really just looking at, okay, am I getting my podcast in front of the right people? Am I getting my content out there to the people who truly need what I have to offer, who can truly benefit from my services and everything? So that is it for this episode. Again, when we work with each other inside a podcast with strategy, I really do support you with developing a streamlined system for repurposing your podcast content and a customized plan for growing your podcast audience with the right people. That's what I'm really big on when you are a business owner with a podcast. Like, I don't want you to have, all these downloads, but you're not making any sales from your podcast, because downloads can't pay your bills. Like, downloads can't really do much for you, but I want you to be able to get your content out there to the people who need it. And repurposing really does help with that, as well as, just being strategic in how you're growing your audience. So if you're looking for that customized support with really developing an effective strategy for your podcast, streamlining, repurposing your podcast content, especially if you're a busy mama, you got limited time, like, I got you. One of my clients I'm working with right now, I helped her with this, and she had been avoiding doing the keyword research and, repurposing her content and all of these things. And so I helped her develop a system and process that works for her. And she was like, yeah, it just added an extra 15 minutes to what I was already doing with producing my podcast. And so it was really simple for her. It doesn't have to be complicated. I get it. You're busy. You don't have a lot of time. And so I'm going to show you how to do it in a super efficient way. But anyways, you can learn more about Podcast with Strategy at mamaturnedmompreneur.com/podcast with strategy. All right, mama, I'll catch you in the next episode. Hey, mama. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to hang with me. I would love to keep the conversation going. So head to mamaturnedmompreneur.com/marketing without socials to join my email community. I share even more tips and strategies for building a business that doesn't rely on social media and one that fits your current season of life, as well as more behind the scenes of mom and business life. All right, mama, that's it for today, but I'll catch up with you again next week.